Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 14 of Untold Wealth, your favorite podcast about economic history. And I'm joined by my co host,
Vince below.
and we are going to be chatting about how can a monopoly even fail? Whew, Vince, I thought this would be an easier topic. I thought there
Uh-huh.
would be a plethora of monopolies failing. And there are definitely a few. I mean, things have failed. Monopolies would definitely be one of them. As a motorbike whizzes past my apartment, I apologize. Monopolies have failed, but few of them, not a lot, which is a little bit concerning. I thought there'd be a lot more. Um, yeah, and I kind of wanted to chat about what I would probably consider the biggest monopoly in the world. And I am making the distinction between cartels and monopolies here.
That is an important
Monopolies,
thing. Yeah.
yes. I mean, they kind of operate the same way. They are obviously monopolizing resources or oligopolizing resources or whatever you want to say. But monopolies are kind of one entity where cartels have this either implicit or explicit agreement to work together. So we're going to be talking about monopolies, or at least I am. Well, keen to see what Vince is going to be chatting about. But I'm going to open us up with a quote.
Before you
I've been.
begin,
Mm,
I wanted to ask monopolies. Just off the bat, are you staunchly against? What's your opinions? What are we coming in? What's the context here?
so before learning about monopolies, I was staunchly against monopolies. I am not as opposed to them now, although I'm pretty fervently opposed to them. But this is pretty much due to something our lecturer told us, I think in first year classes or even second year classes of university, was that monopolies are still adherent to the laws of supply and demand. They can't quite price gouge as much as consumers think they can. Consumers still, they're the only supplier of a certain good, but consumers to a certain price range can just do without the good. So monopolies don't have as much power. They are very inefficient and cause a deadweight loss to themselves and to consumers, but they are not as bad as I thought they would be.
Interesting. Okay.
What about you? What about you?
Well, I mean, researching this and with the background that I have, I came to kind of an interesting conclusion that I kind of see monopolies as like the economic equivalent of like dictators in the economy. Um, but not solely, I suppose, because of the kind of economic implications of it, but, and maybe I'll just save this for when I chat about them, but the kind of like internal bureaucracy that goes between them.
It's
But
like
I want
their values, they have like an
exactly.
internal value system that, yeah, you could definitely compare to some dictator figures throughout history. Yeah, no, I could see that for sure. Yeah, I'm keen to see what you're going to chat about. But yes, onto a quote. It's a running gag between Vince and I that Vince thoroughly outdoes me in terms of quotes every single episode. I mean, whether he comes up with his own ones and and
That's not going to change this episode, trust me.
okay, well, there's going to be a few quotes, but hey, listen, I have a pretty good one. All right, all right, here it goes. Your honors should know by experience that trade in Asia must be driven and maintained under the protection and favor of your honor's own weapons, and that the
Ooh,
weapons must be paid for by the profits from the trade, and that we cannot carry on trade without war, nor war without trade. And this is a
those are some
quote.
stirring words.
Those are some stirring words, very old stuff. But this is from a gentleman from the infamous Dutch East India Company. All right.
Hmm.
To give you some facts about the Dutch East India Company, um, they have a Dutch name for themselves. The acronym is VOC. I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce those words. All you need to know is kind of in English, it's the Dutch East India Company. They were a company that was valued at, guess how many trillions in their prime, Vince?
4 point. I mean, trillions already is out. Blows my
Ridiculous.
mind.
Ridiculous.
I'm gonna go modest. I'm just gonna say 1.5 trillion, 2 trillion maybe.
You can times that by four if you said 2 trillion. They were worth about 8 trillion at the height of their power in around the 1700s. All right, maybe late 1600s. 8 trillion. They had their own army, they had their own currency, and they were the first. Well, I think they were the first. I mean, what I've researched has indicated that they were the first ever publicly traded company with an initial public offering, an IPO.
Huh.
Can you believe it? That's the Dutch East India Company, ladies and gentlemen. And they were a nasty force in the 1600s and the 1700s because they effectively built a monopoly around spice roots. Very interestingly enough, they were backed by the Netherlands, the government itself. They were kind of like obviously a public company, but a private institution that kind of was designed to bring money back into the Netherlands to basically grow independence from their Spanish, governance. The Spaniards, I mean, we talked about the siege of Antwerp
Yeah, yeah,
a
yeah.
few episodes ago. That was kind of a part of this Dutch revolution against the Spaniards. If you can remember, Antwerp was sieged by the Spanish. The Spanish ended up winning the siege, or breaking the siege rather, and entering the city. And they kind of told all the Dutch people, "Hey, go back to the Netherlands. This place is ours. You have 2 years to get out." There was a more interesting story than that. But yes, the Dutch East India Company, fueled by the world's need for spice in the 1600s, specifically, weirdly enough, nutmeg. Nutmeg is kind of the spice that is talked about in this period. Listen, I can't tell you what nutmeg is used for. Baking, curries. I'm honestly not too sure. Like, I'm not a cooking guy, as you can probably tell.
It sounds
But yeah,
expensive though.
nutmeg's expensive, and it was very expensive back then. Partially because of the monopoly that the Dutch East India Company had, and a few of the atrocities they committed along the way. But we're definitely going to get there. But this is kind of the timeline. So in 1600s, okay, the Netherlands, which are the Dutch people, if you don't know, they were kind of semi-conquered, but were allowed to do their own thing by the Spaniards. They only really gained independence in 1648 through the success of the Dutch East India Company. But how the Dutch East India Company came about was that before Portugal got incorporated into the Spanish Empire, the Dutch used to trade with spices that they purchased from Portugal. The Portuguese had most of the spice trade routes along the Mediterranean, Indian Seas, all right? And then they kind of just marked it up and made quite a hefty profit on those spices. But as soon as the Spaniards kind of pushed the Dutch towards the Netherlands and incorporated Portugal into their empire, they said, no, no trading with Lisbon, do your own thing. And that left quite a significant void for the Dutchmen, who were sailors, but they didn't have the routes themselves, and they didn't have Lisbon to trade with and to mark up their goods on. So they, from I think 1595 to about 1601, decided to build their own ships and explore the Indian Ocean, especially the Indonesian area of the world, in search
Right.
of trade routes and partners. Some places where the Portuguese haven't quite touched yet, or even if they have touched, kind of make a deal around there. And it wasn't very successful. Like, apparently, 1 in every 10 ships they sent out didn't come back. And the ships that did come back, on average, only a third of the crew survived. So it was very perilous. Lots of people died, basically. But in the grand scheme of things, it was a great success because they did discover routes and they made connections with a lot of trading ports, all right? Specifically in Indonesia, all right, where kind of the source of nutmeg was, okay? So the Netherlands government says, all right, let us capitalism the hell out of this. And
That's like the
yes,
slogan for like Europe at that point in time, I think.
yes, for sure. And they too sure like kind of the intricacies behind it, but the Dutch East India Company was created. which effectively they made a building in the middle of Amsterdam, all right, which kind of was used as the first stock exchange in the world, and at the same time
No
was the
kidding.
first IPO and fundraising collection for the company that was to be created. All right, and it raised about $110 million in today's standards. It
Yeah.
was a very big success, right? It was also the first time it's ever happened. So it was new technology, new finance technology. As weird as that sounds to this day, it was new finance, and it was the cutting edge of finance, which gave a big advantage over the British spice trade routes, the British companies who were actually in competition with each other. So there were a bunch of British traders that kind of had access to the same trade routes that Portugal did, but they were all vying against each other, which made the prices low, which made the profits a bit lower than what they could have, and which kind of didn't benefit the British government quite as much as the Dutch East India Company that you'll see did. Yeah, so they kind of monopolized trade. They started building their own army with Netherlands funds, and they started quite literally destroying Portuguese and obviously by extension Spanish vessels along the way. And by 1648, they had complete control of these spice routes that 40 years earlier was dominated by the Portuguese and thus the Spanish. And then they came
When
along
you
the
when you say they were destroying the Portuguese and Spanish, do you mean literally, or do you mean like in terms of profits?
no, no, literally, but probably both. But probably both. No, there was. I'm not too sure if it was an outright war because at around the 1600s, well, late 1500s and early 1600s, the Spanish was at war with the British, so they kind of turned a blind eye to the Dutch at that stage, which allowed them to do their early expeditions, as I explained. But no, they quite literally killed a lot of people. Yeah, it was warfare. I'm not too sure if it was an outright war though. It was kind of like a trade war, kind of like Eve Online. Very dystopian like that, right? It was a mega corporation built by a country with its own army. Ridiculous. And I think one of the reasons that was cited for that power that the Netherlands gave the Dutch East India Company was because communications took so long to come back to the Netherlands. I read something like it took a year for messages to get relayed,
Jeez.
consistently at least, because seafaring was quite dangerous, even when you had like monopoly over the trade routes, I suppose. But I mean, I could be wrong about that specific thing. I mean, 1 year sounds too long. Yeah, it sounds too long, but it could be true.
I mean, if you're
Who
talking about
knows?
like Dutch ships being in Indonesia, like that is basically halfway across the world. So it wouldn't surprise me if, at that point in time, the quickest mode of transport would be like a boat, if that took
Yeah,
an entire year to relay messages back.
yeah. I mean, even in the Antwerp episode, we talked about the Spanish road, but even in that episode, I said, hey, listen, boats were the fastest form of communication, resupply, and everything. Whoever had trade routes had the power in those days. So that's how much power the Dutch East India Company had. And it still took them a long time to get messages relayed, apparently. Whatever, it doesn't really matter. But all right, let's talk about nutmeg a little bit because this is kind of like the poster boy of the Dutch East India Company's atrocity was that there's these few islands in Indonesia, all right, and there's some local people, and a few islands in Indonesia were the only places where nutmeg was created back in those days. That was the nutmeg like supply chain, right? And these tribesmen were quite good at um, marketing themselves and having trade with different countries. They traded with the British, Chinese, Japanese, Portuguese, Spanish. They did it all, and they did stand on a few toes, but they were pretty good at it, right? They had their own system going. I can't quite remember the people's names, but unfortunately, uh, what the Dutch did is they kind of said, "Hey, sign this agreement. It's an exclusivity contract. You can't trade with anyone else, and we'll give you quote unquote protection, right?" But these people broke the contract inherently. I mean, they traded with everyone. But in the past, when they did that, it didn't backfire on them. like, hey, we're the only nutmeg supplier. Do you still want to trade with us? All right, cool. But
I mean, if they're only getting reports back a year later that these guys are have broken the exclusivity contract, I guess from their perspective, it's like, hey, we might as well trade with everyone.
yes, I mean, yeah, I like we're definitely getting into the weeds of it, but yeah, they hadn't been punished badly in the past. Like, I use punish loosely. Whether they should be punished or not is, you know, not really up for debate. They really shouldn't be. But but the Dutch invaded, and they pretty much committed mass genocide of this people. I think it was like a sprawling nation of hundreds of thousands of people
Jeez.
and it got brought down to about like 1,000 people, and they had to leave their islands to other islands, and only some of that culture still remains to this day. Weirdly enough, that general, who I quoted at the beginning of this episode, his name was Jean something something. I'll butcher his name, but he was hailed as a hero in the Netherlands.
Of course.
Yeah, crazily enough. So yeah, the Dutch got immensely wealthy. The Dutch East India Company was the most valued company in human history. $8 trillion. That is the US economy, right? The US GDP right now is $23 trillion. Chinese economy is 17. So half of the Chinese economy right now, that is what the Dutch East India Company was.
And for the 1600s, mind you, like that is insane because there's not really any other big industries like that for it to even trade with to a mass. Like it blows my mind. I mean, built on atrocities, yes. It's pretty crazy though.
But I mean, that just shows you that you get the cutting edge of technology. You get the cutting edge of like product and maybe distribution and spice routes. But they're the cutting edge of a financial institution that people really believed in and kind of just propelled it to success, which is wow. All right.
It's crazy.
So this episode is talking about how monopolies fail.
Yes.
How did the monopoly fail? All right, because it did really well. Basically, they took all the money. The Netherlands obviously took some of the money because they kind of backed this country. It was kind of like their trade partner and army at the same time. And they said, okay, give us some money. We want to expand the Netherlands. How the Netherlands works geographically wise, that's very flat land and it's below sea level. So very, very, very prone to floods. So since their independence in 1658, they kind of erected dams and dikes and changed the entire geography of the Netherlands to resemble what it is today, which a lot of farmland and a lot of abundance in terms of geography. Pretty crazy. But how did it fail? Well, there's three reasons that I can find. The first reason is they lost a pretty bad war to the British in the 1780s. And that wasn't like the nail in the coffin. If it wasn't the nail in the nail in the coffin came when the French invaded in the 1790s. I'm not too sure if that was Napoleon. I don't know my French history. Maybe you know better than me. But they got dumpstered there. And then the world kind of turned its eyes away from nutmeg and the other spices that they were known for trading with and having a monopoly over towards cotton and sugar, which we both know succumbed to some terrible, slavery practices, just as much as the Dutch East India Company did to other nations with all their colonies that they created, other than the ones in Indonesia. They pretty much took over all the colonies that Portugal had made. But
Right.
yeah, as a South African, the Dutch East India Company is related to our history. Jan van Riebeeck discovered, Cape Town. That was originally a port of call for the company when they were trying to, make their way to the Indian Ocean. Durban as well was a notable harbor that they used. So it's very closely related to South African history. Those were kind of the first, white settlers. As weird as that sounds. Yeah, we've heard about Jan van Riebeeck. We know him. We got taught about him in history. But I didn't know that the Dutch East India Company was such a bad, had such a bad rep.
Yeah,
But
I
yeah,
mean,
like,
jinx. Um, the Dutch East India Company is kind of like this. You learn about it in high school economics and things like that. I mean, maybe that's just from a South African perspective. But putting into the perspective that you have, not only the wealth that they've created largely like a single spice like nutmeg, is astounding. The means through which they got it, not great. But the fact that like they were on the forefront for things like initial public offerings, and I'm sure like a few other notable like trade routes and things like that is quite cool from an economics perspective. Um, and yeah, like I I was going to ask, it's if you had like a monopoly on a single spice, either during the time or in the modern day, is there anyone that you'd like go to
Just repeat the question. If I had to choose a monopoly for a
on
given
a
spice,
single spice?
um, yeah, like I would just off the top of the dome piece, salt or pepper for sure. Like no doubt, no doubt.
I'll
Um,
probably say the same because like
mm,
at those times, it's difficult to kind of imagine nowadays, but those spices like salt, pepper, and nutmeg is a little bit more abstract, but those were like things that people didn't just have in their kitchen cupboards.
mm.
Like the fact that you can have a monopoly on a spice such as that is quite
There,
crazy.
there was a Chinese company called the Salt Commission, which kind of had a monopoly on salt within China, I believe. But it was more like they taxed it in certain regions for the state, and they kind of controlled it up until like apparently 2016, which is wild. It was from the
Jeez.
what was 1200s to 2016. I can't believe it. I didn't research it that thoroughly though, but I did like see it in my research, which is crazy. But guys, that is from my perspective how monopoly fails. A war, a monopoly that big fails. A war into the value of the goods that were very valuable for 200 years falling off a cliff.
I see.
That is kind of scary. That is what it takes to topple a monopoly. But yes, all right, Vince. Let's see what you cooked up, sir.
Okay. I mean, firstly, I want to say how nice it is to be treated to a history episode from you. Uh, that was really fun to listen to. And I'm always happy to chat about like the history of economics because it is fascinating. And it's really cool because I'm actually going to be talking about a more contemporary setting on why monopolies fail, or at least why the monopolies that have failed, why those things happen to them. And to reiterate at the very start of the episode, I do kind of see monopolies as these like strange, I suppose, dictators of the economy. And I think there's a lot of parallels there that could lead to answer the question of how monopolies could even fail. And looking in, doing my research, I have noted that, at least in the contemporary setting, there's exactly two main reasons why monopolies fail. And how did I get there? Took a look at them and saw that there were two common trends. And maybe this little quote from mine might lead you on to what they are. It's a quote from the CEO of Mayflower Plymouth. This is Hendrith Van Loan Smith Jr. And the quote reads as, when industries lack competition, businesses get belligerent. Competition helps keep businesses humble. And that businesses get belligerent is the part that I want you to focus on uh, quite a bit. Do you have any ideas just based off the very vague clues that I've given you?
Um, you said trends, so this isn't like me guessing like a company that you're about to talk about.
Exactly.
I think the trend that you're referring to is kind of this idea that competition breeds innovation, and that is not present in a monopoly. Is that correct?
Wow. A plus. But
Thank you, thank you.
that's one of the two that I've found. And let
Mm,
me list off a few monopolies that have failed, as in they have had a dominant share of the market and now are either bankrupt or is not as prominent. And I want to see if you can find the other one. So the first example that I have for today is Kodak. Kodak is a company that mainly sells products related to photography, lenses, cameras, that sort of thing. And they were once a fairly dominant player in the photography industry. If you bought an analog camera with film and things like that, it would likely have been from Kodak. They, through their kind of years in the market, failed to kind of embrace the digital photography that was slowly becoming more and more popular. And there's this a really great quote from the person who made the digital camera, uh, Mr. Sampson, Steve Sampson. He was working for Kodak at the time, and he says, in relation to him talking to Kodak officials about introducing a digital camera, he says, every digital camera that was sold took away from a film camera, and we knew how much money we made on film. That was the argument. Of course, the problem is pretty soon you won't be able to sell film, and that was my position. So keep Kodak in mind, and let's talk about another company, AT&T, the American Telephone and Telegraph Company. This is a fairly more recent, same time frame actually. AT&T was a telecommunications company based in the United States, and they dominated the telecommunications space during the 20th century. Like they had basically the entire United States telecommunications were based or provided by AT&T.
They still exist, right? Like
They still exist.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Just checking.
But in 1982, as a result of a antitrust lawsuit brought by the US government, AT&T was broken up into a couple of what they call like baby bell companies. So they were essentially split into smaller little companies. And so there's still an AT&T, but there's also like a Verizon, and there's Bell South. There's around 7 of them. And that broke up AT&T's monopoly status. Another company, Standard Oil, which is fairly prominent, being founded by J.D. Rockefeller in the late 19th century. They controlled a lot of the processes to do with oil, so refining, transportation, distribution. And this kind of mentions one of the things that makes a monopoly are these barriers to entry. And oil being this resource that at the time, and still to a large extent today, doesn't have a very close substitute. J.D. Rockefeller and Standard Oil had a complete control over everything to do with oil. And in 1911, the Supreme Court of the United States ordered a breakup of them as well, also into several smaller independent companies because of antitrust concerns. My final example is of IBM, who were quite prominent in the early computing stage. And they were quite prominent in the 1990s and had a fairly dominant market share of computers. However, as time went on, technology specifically had a very rapid increase in the sophistication of the technology, and they kind of struggled to keep up. There were some kind of bureaucratic and other internal reasons from the company, a lot of conservatism, but they were very reluctant and slow to change to embrace what I'm using today, and likely you are, which is the personal computer revolution, which ended up being the demise of IBM.
Weren't they the main competitor to Apple? I could be getting my history incorrect, but I think there's like an interview about Steve Jobs saying how he hated IBM and the monopoly that they had. But I could be wrong. Maybe it was like, for some reason I was thinking of Xerox. I don't think it's Xerox. I didn't even know what Xerox does, actually.
No, I think Xerox is in there, but yeah, absolutely. I mean, Apple was fighting against this monopoly, which, it's kind of difficult to think of Apple as like an underdog, but at the time, with the I think it's the iMac or the Mac something.
Macintosh. That was their kind of their
Macintosh.
flagship. Yeah, flagship.
Yes, correct. That was a big part of it. But IBM, whether, to a number of reasons, didn't really embrace this personal computer revolution as other companies that we know today have. So, yeah, given those four companies, you've already mentioned innovation, which is one of the main trends that I saw. But is there anything that stands out to you other than that?
So, what's the second trend? And Devon, can you identify the second trend given these four anecdotes I've just presented you with? Great. I can't really. I mean, two of them were slain uh by the government, FTC, antitrust.
Yes.
One was slain by failing to adapt, which is kind of the innovation. So I don't know. What's the other trend in knocking down monopolies according to this? I honestly couldn't tell you. I would suppose it would just be stringent government regulation breaking them up. That would be my guess. Bam.
Beautiful.
Oh yeah.
Innovation and regulation.
Oof, slides
Those
off the tongue.
it's it's beautiful. Thank you so much. That is joy. Thank you. uh, yeah, those are the two most powerful forces that I've seen so far, and the monopolies that have failed. Why those monopolies fell? Well, likely due to one of those two um, reasons. I mean, there's some others, but the large majority, I found at least, fell into those two categories. And yeah, I mean, I had a pretty interesting like research dive here where it's not easy to paint a monopoly in a sympathetic light, but when you're looking at all these monopolies that have fallen, I kind of found it like, man, some of these monopolies had it pretty rough uh, because innovation is kind of this natural enemy of monopolies. Um, One of the big criteria of monopolies, which I mentioned earlier, are barriers to entry. And if you're not something like Standard Oil, where you have a complete domination of a product that has no close substitutes, a lot of the money and your attention is being focused to keeping those barriers to entry very high. So stopping other companies from entering your market, stopping them from, you know, copying your product. And so naturally, I think at least, there's a lot less focus on innovating that product as other companies kind of sprout up and the market shifts and changes.
Yeah, they just say no, I want it, greed, and instead of like, hey, we were built to like give, give and receive. Now it's like, you know, don't really give back, keep. I don't know.
Exactly.
That was, that was the most forehead thing I've ever said in my life.
Well,
Just cut that out. Cut that out. I don't know where I was going with that.
I actually do like it because the other thing I was going to talk about is regulation. Regulation is obviously there to stop monopolies because generally people and governments agree that monopolies are a bad idea. And even though, as you might have said, that the degree to which, monopolies might be villainized in our minds in terms of how much they can exploit consumers isn't as bad as maybe in our heads. They are still bad for the average consumer and can lead to some very unfair market situations. So having the government be essentially a lookout and employ antitrust policies is, I think, a very good thing. And there's kind of a continuous battle that monopolies face from the external side, which is government and regulation, and internally, where they are so focused on other stuff and not really pushing their company to innovate. And there's this kind of interesting quote by Thomas J. Watson, who was the chairman or one of the chairmen for IBM. And he basically said, I think there is a world market for about 5 computers, which in hindsight is a terrible and dumb thing to say. But it also is contrasted by another quote that he says, where the quote is, whenever an individual or a business decides that success has been attained, progress stops. Which, when reading those two side by side, it's like, aren't those two contradictory? Um, like, what's your impression of that? Because that left me very confused when I heard it.
So the first quote was like, basically, there's a world market for only five computers, like five different brands in computing. So that was the first quote.
Yeah,
Okay, and the second quote was, I've just forgotten. It was along the lines that, oh yeah, as soon as success is, being achieved, innovation stops completely. Um, yeah, I mean, I guess I would think they're at odds with each other. It depends on what you would measure success in and to what extent you think a monopoly or even an oligopoly exists, right?
yeah,
If you think like cell phone market, there's a good few players in the cell phone market. There's more players in the car market, like which is an oligopoly. What's the line where it's drawn? I actually don't know. I don't know. I'll have to think about that. What do you think?
well, I like the road that you're going down, which is that like it does depend on the market that the company is based in. But when I read that, I was like, it's interesting that, like what is going through the minds and the psychology behind the people who run these companies, these monopolies. Because surely, IBM could have looked at Kodak or other monopolies, and even though they are in separate industries, they why don't like companies or CEOs, the higher ups in a company of a monopoly, learn to just innovate, or like pay off some government officials to stop their regulation, which has and kind of is happening in modern uh, companies. But the confusion that brought me kind of led me down a separate road, which brings me to like a third reason why I think monopolies fail, which is the psychological aspects that people in monopolies have. These businesses that get belligerent when they lack competition. To circle all the way back to that first quote, which I said. And there's this great book called Why Smart Executives Fail, which is basically a research paper done by a couple of people, the first name of which, the main writer is called Sydney. And they looked at a couple of companies, not monopolies as far as I can tell, and investigated why the executives in those companies led the company down the road to failure. And I think a lot of it can be pushed over to monopolies. And basically, I think a lot of monopolies have these same traits. At least their higher ups do. And the first is that, yeah, monopolies get complacent. When you have such a good situation where you have the single seller, no competition, you have all the market power. Companies tend to become complacent, overconfident, and in some extents, quite arrogant. To
I wouldn't consider that smart. Tell me about why they're smart and that's why they fail. That's what I want to know. Yeah, yeah.
well, the book in particular has kind of an interesting question brought to them where it's like these seven habits of unsuccessful people, which is the accumulation of what they saw in these companies. And like a lot of it is to do with this because from an in like we can say that, oh no, these people are complacent, they're overconfident, they're arrogant, but from their perspective, even if they are smart, I could argue that they are not immune to being all these uh, falling into all these kind of fallacies, I suppose. And yeah, I guess the main point that I'm trying to make here is that as much as monopolies are being targeted not only by regulation and other companies and failing to innovate, I think there's an argument to be made that the psychological parts of the CEOs and the higher up management are as much of a part of why monopolies fail as these other things. Um, Yeah. Well,
Yeah,
what are your thoughts
because
on that?
well, I think smartness doesn't breed innovation. Boldness does, right?
Yes.
And you don't really call bold people smart. Does that make sense? You kind of call them their own kind. They're their own kind of beast. Smart people look at the numbers and they try keep the trajectory, but that I don't think that works long term like they think it will. You have to get someone in there that innovates, that makes the trajectory skyrocket again, and then the smart person can take over and keep it going for a bit longer. Then you need to get someone else in. That's just my kind of way I'm looking at it right now. I mean, even we were discussing about, I think we chatted about IQ in one of
Yes.
our episodes, and there was a bit of a correlation between IQ and proposed and like earnings, but
Hmm.
they were like major outliers in terms of low IQ individuals and how much they earned. Like they were just crazy outliers. They earned a crap ton, and they had like some of the lowest IQs on that measurement. Just one study, basically. I mean, we talked about how IQ doesn't really matter, but that's kind of what I'm thinking along the lines of. Like they just do, inherently, not societally smart people just do, and they do until they succeed, and they innovate until they succeed. I don't think smart people do that. They try hold on to things. That's kind of where I
Yeah.
was trying to take it. But hey, I mean, we'll never know if that's really true.
I
Maybe
mean,
that
I
book holds the answer.
I don't deny that people likely who run these companies are smart. But yeah, I do think that like when you are in a position of being the head of a monopoly, when you are kind of the sole, you hold like a lot of power, and not to be very cliche about power corrupting, but I think there's a lot of bad bad voodoo that comes with it mentally, like overconfidence, complacency, and arrogance. Like
Welcome
if
to
you
the Economics Podcast, where we talk about bad voodoo. Yes, of course, of course. Why monopolies fail? Bad voodoo from success.
bad voodoo, like
Vince Black.
if you,
There's your quote, but
I, I'm very excited to have a quote finally attributed to me. Like if you are like the head of a monopoly and everything's working great, full market share, and someone comes to you with a product, innovation, or something like to, you know, change things up a bit, you're like, why would I do that when I have things so good right now? And
mm,
that is such an arrogant thing to do. So yeah, I think, I mean, I imagine the other parts of like things are vastly more complicated than simple psychology, but I think it does play a really cool part in the downfalls of monopolies, which, in my perspective, are you know shouldn't exist in the first place. So I'm happy to study it and provide a little bit more of a niche perspective on
I agree with your three theories. Yeah, and I agree with mine as well. Wars can stop monopolies too.
it. No,
What do you think about public good monopolies? What do you think
public
about
good.
what do you think about ESCOM? What do you think about electricity suppliers run by the state or whatever like that? Postal
So I
services.
right, I think. I mean, I guess it's all about the incentive of the company. Um, like a monopoly has kind of the incentive to make a profit. And the way they go about that is by, not playing fairly, not innovating, but just erecting barriers to entry and controlling as much as they can. I think when the incentive is removed from uh, that, so like ESCOM and postal services are run by a government who has revenue in mind, but have has other priorities uh,
Hmm.
to focus on. I think in those cases, like I mean, we could talk about like corruption and things, but in a perfect world, I think the government is kind of a monopoly on public goods and infrastructure and things like that.
Deep, bro. Deep, very deep. You know, there was like this meme when I was like 12 or 11 or 13 or whatever. And it went along the lines of it's like some dude on a train, I think it was from like an anime. And there was some text on it, and it was like, a skilled dictator is better than the best functioning democracy. And it was like from r/I'm 14 and the steep.
That's
and like
very edgy.
young Devon was like, oh yeah. Oh, if I was in that position. Oh, if I was the dictator, so smooth. And I think you can kind of like have a little bit of like banter with yourself, like, wow, if a monopoly was just like really good and did set reasonable and realistic, competitive like what would be market prices if a market existed in a monopoly. Does that make sense? Yes. You'd be like, yeah, monopoly is pretty good. It was just like, it's so easy for a consumer just to go to the one dude or one company and be assured that they're paying kind of like the best possible price.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's never going to happen with a monopoly. Like, that's never going to happen. Just like how when a dictator takes over, they're not going to impose nearly what a good functioning democracy would impose on a nation. They just wouldn't. Yeah, I mean, and that is my political development these past 10 to 12 years.
As you said in this episode, monopolies are kind of fueled by greed, much like dictatorships, where it's very much about funneling that money up to either the chair people or the dictator, or just trying to keep that company, the company's line going up and to the right, basically. And yeah, I think it's just when that's the root of why you're doing things, it's never going to really be beneficial for everybody. But yeah, I think Monopoly is super fascinating, and I'm very excited to hear what you, our dear listeners, have to talk about. Are there any monopolies that you think don't fall into my 3 little criteria? Do you have any monopolies that are, even older than the one that Devon mentioned, the Dutch East India Company? Please let us know in the comments. And while you're there, drop us a like, hit subscribe. It does help us out if you've enjoyed the episode. But until then, I've been Vince Balak.
And Devon.
And this has been Untold Wealth, episode 14.